Victoria Hayes had just fired a technician nobody thought twice about, an aging mechanic she dismissed as slow, outdated, and no longer worth his paycheck. 3 weeks later, 22 aircraft sat grounded on the tarmac, one after another, crippled by failures that the company's top engineers could not explain or repair no matter how many hours they poured into the effort. In an emergency meeting filled with panic, blame, and raised voices, Victoria finally asked one question that silenced the entire room in a single breath. She wanted to know who used to fix all these planes before any of this started. Who had kept them flying safely, year after year, without a single incident. Nobody answered right away, and the silence stretched long enough to feel physical, pressing against the walls of the glass conference room. Then, slowly, every pair of eyes in that room drifted toward the same place, an empty workbench near the far wall of the hangar. The desk that had belonged to the man she herself had let go without a second thought. Falcon Aero had built its reputation over 3 decades as one of the most trusted private aviation maintenance companies on the eastern seaboard, known for precision, discipline, and an almost obsessive devotion to safety that clients paid handsomely to rely upon. Victoria Hayes, at 40 years old, had taken over as chief executive only 18 months earlier, the youngest person to ever hold that title in the company's long history. She was sharp, ambitious, and relentlessly modern, determined to drag Falcon Aero out of what she privately called its outdated culture and into a new era built on automation, digital dashboards, and streamlined efficiency. She believed the future of aviation maintenance belonged to speed and clean data, not sentiment or tradition, and she measured every employee's worth in numbers displayed neatly on a screen. Board members admired her for it, investors trusted her instincts, and within her first year, she had already replaced nearly a third of the company's senior technical staff with younger hires fluent in the newest diagnostic software. She walked the hangar floor most mornings with a tablet in hand, scanning efficiency reports the way other executives might scan headlines, searching always for the next weak link to remove. One young engineer named Marcus Webb, barely 2 years out of college and proud of the certification badges lined up neatly on his jacket, used to joke openly in the break room that the hangar needed fewer museum pieces and more people who actually understood modern systems. He never said it directly to Daniel's face, but he never bothered to lower his voice either, certain that a man who still carried a pencil behind his ear had nothing left to teach anyone in a world now run by predictive software. Other young hires laughed along without really thinking about it, the way people often laugh at whatever the room seems to expect of them, and the joke settled quietly into the culture of the hangar, without anyone ever questioning where it had come from. Daniel heard it plenty of times over the years, passing behind those same conversations with a toolbox in hand, and never once stopped to correct anyone or defend himself. He simply kept working, the same steady rhythm every single day, as though the opinions circling around him belonged to a conversation he had never actually agreed to join. Daniel Brooks did not fit into any of Victoria's spreadsheets, and in many ways, he seemed to belong to an entirely different company than the one she had inherited. At 40 years old himself, he had spent 18 years inside that same hangar, working with his hands long before software had ever offered to tell him what was wrong with an engine. He was a single father, though nobody at Falcon Aero ever heard him mention it, since his son had long since grown and moved away, and the subject simply never came up in casual conversation. Daniel rarely spoke unless spoken to, wore the same faded blue uniform every single day regardless of the season, and never once mentioned the countless times he had quietly saved a flight from disaster before it ever reached the runway. To the younger technicians who had joined in the last few years, chasing certifications and career advancement, he was simply the old man who tightened bolts, a relic from an era they assumed had nothing left to teach them about a business now driven by algorithms and predictive software. Victoria noticed him during one of her efficiency reviews, watching him move at what she considered an unhurried, almost stubborn pace, while younger staff rushed past him with tablets and handheld diagnostic scanners. She saw a man who still preferred paper notes over digital logs, who ran his fingers along a fuselage instead of trusting a sensor readout on a screen, who took twice as long as anyone else to sign off on a routine inspection. She did not see the years of quiet reasoning behind his caution, only the surface appearance of inefficiency. and within the tidy logic of her spreadsheets. That appearance alone was enough to condemn him. She asked her operations director for his full personnel file, flipped through pages of unremarkable performance reviews written by supervisors who had never bothered to understand what he actually did, and made her decision within the hour. When she finally sat across from him in her glass-walled office and told him the company was moving in a different direction, she used the phrase she had rehearsed in her head for weeks, telling him plainly and without warmth that he no longer fit where Falcon Arrow was headed. Daniel did not argue. He did not raise his voice, did not list his 18 years of service, did not plead for a second chance or ask her to reconsider the way she had quietly expected him to. He simply nodded once, reached into his pocket, and placed his employee badge on the polished surface of her desk, without a single word of protest. Victoria remembered feeling a flicker of surprise at his silence, though she told herself it only confirmed she had made the right call, that a man who truly cared about his job would have fought harder to keep it, would have argued his case the way every other employee in that position had done before him. She watched him rise from the chair, straighten the collar of his worn uniform out of pure habit, and walk out of the building that afternoon, his shoulders steady beneath a light autumn drizzle that had settled over the entire tarmac since early morning, turning the whole airfield the color of wet slate. Before he reached the parking lot, Daniel paused beside Hangar 3, where an old Boeing airframe sat waiting quietly for its next scheduled flight. He stood there for a long moment in the rain, looking up at the plane the way another man might look at an old friend he was not certain he would ever see again. He reached out and rested one hand briefly against the cold metal of the fuselage, the same gesture he had performed thousands of times before every takeoff over 18 years, though this time there was no clipboard in his other hand, and no schedule waiting for him afterward. Nobody in that hangar knew, not even Victoria herself, that the man walking slowly away in the rain understood the internal architecture of every single aircraft on that tarmac more intimately than anyone else who had ever worked there, including every engineer with a framed degree hanging proudly on the wall of the very building he had just left behind for good. The first sign of trouble arrived exactly 1 week later, when a routine pre-flight check on one of the smaller jets returned an error nobody could immediately trace to its source. The newly hired technicians replaced a sensor, ran the diagnostics twice, and confidently declared the aircraft fit to fly, only for the same warning light to reappear less than an hour before departure. A second plane developed an unrelated issue 2 days after that, then a third the following morning, each failure slightly different from the last, each one stubbornly resistant to every standard fix listed in the manufacturer's manual. Within 2 weeks, the pattern had spread across the entire fleet like something contagious, until 22 aircraft sat motionless on the ground, wings folded beneath gray autumn skies, costing the company millions of dollars in canceled charters and increasingly furious clients, demanding answers nobody could give them. Marcus Webb, the same young engineer who once joked so freely about museum pieces, was assigned to lead the diagnostic effort on the fourth aircraft to fail, confident that his advanced training would settle the matter within a single afternoon. He ran every test the manufacturer's software offered, cross-referenced the results against 3 separate technical databases, and replaced 2 components that seemed statistically likely to be the culprit based on historical failure rates. The plane failed its inspection again the following morning, exactly as it had before. And Marcus found himself standing in front of Victoria, unable to explain why his careful, data-driven process had produced absolutely nothing useful. It was the first time in his short career that his credentials had failed to provide him with an answer, and the experience left him quieter than his coworkers had ever seen him before. Victoria's fury grew sharper with every passing day, and she began summoning anyone she thought might offer even a partial answer, from her head of technical operations to outside consultants, flown in directly from the aircraft manufacturer at enormous expense. Engineers with decades of formal training and impressive credentials pored over technical schematics, ran simulation software late into the night, and left the hangar each evening looking more exhausted and more baffled than the day before. Every diagnostic system insisted the same maddening thing, that everything appeared to be within normal operating parameters. And yet the planes continued failing their final inspections one after another, as though something invisible were quietly mocking the very instruments meant to detect it. Reporters from a regional business publication had already begun asking pointed questions about the sudden grounding, and Victoria found herself rehearsing careful non-answers in the mirror before every call. She stood alone in the hangar late one night, surrounded by machines that refused to make any sense at all. And for the first time since taking the corner office, she felt something close to real, unfiltered fear settle into her chest. It was during one of those long, fruitless nights that Victoria finally walked down into the maintenance level herself. Unwilling to keep waiting for reports from people who clearly had nothing new left to tell her, she wandered through the narrow back corridors of the hangar, past rows of tool cabinets and labeled bins of spare parts, until she reached a small storage alcove she had never once bothered to notice during her many efficiency walkthroughs. Stacked along one wall were dozens of worn notebooks, their covers cracked and stained with old motor oil, filled front to back with handwriting so dense and precise, it looked almost like a private language only one person alive could fully read. An older mechanic nearby, a heavy-set man, who had been with the company almost as long as Daniel, told her quietly, almost reverently, that those notebooks belonged to him, the technician she had let go 3 weeks earlier. Victoria pulled one of the notebooks down and opened it beneath the dim overhead light, and what she found inside made her breath catch somewhere in her throat. Every page held detailed sketches of individual aircraft systems, annotated with specific failure histories, stretching back years, tiny irregularities noted months or even years apart, and quiet, careful predictions about which components would eventually wear down and roughly when that might happen. None of it existed anywhere in the company's official records, not in the digital maintenance logs, not in the manufacturer's technical bulletins, nowhere at all, except in the patient handwriting of a man nobody had thought to consult before showing him the door with a single sentence. The older mechanic explained, almost apologetically, that these exact 22 planes had been under that man's personal watch for years, and that in all that time, not a single flight under his direct care had ever been canceled because of a mechanical failure of any kind. She flipped further through the notebook and found an entry dated nearly 9 years earlier, describing a landing gear assembly that had shown no signs of trouble on any official inspection report filed that quarter. Daniel had written, in his small, careful hand, that the metal sounded wrong when it settled after a hard landing, a detail so faint that no one else on the crew that day had even noticed it. He had flagged the part for early replacement against the recommendation of a supervisor who insisted the component still had years of service left in it. And 6 months later, an identical part on a sister aircraft failed catastrophically during a routine taxi, grounding that plane for emergency repairs. Nothing in the official record credited Daniel with preventing a similar failure on his own aircraft, and no memo had ever circulated acknowledging the decision that quietly kept his passengers safe that year. Victoria closed the notebook slowly, aware for the first time of just how many silent decisions had been made inside that hangar without her ever knowing they existed at all. Something in Victoria began to shift that night. Standing alone in a quiet hangar with oil-stained pages trembling slightly in her hands, she had spent her entire career believing that competence could be measured cleanly, in speed, in software fluency, in the confident language of quarterly reports delivered to a boardroom full of nodding faces. Yet here was proof of something else entirely, something slower and quieter, and far more difficult to quantify, something no dashboard she had ever built had managed to capture even once. She thought about the calm, almost gentle way he had placed his badge on her desk without argument. And she began to wonder, uncomfortably, whether his silence had meant something entirely different than the surrender she had assumed it to be at the time. For the first time since becoming chief executive, Victoria Hayes found herself genuinely doubting a decision she had once made, with total, unshakable confidence. Over the following days, she pulled together fragments of his history from people who remembered him clearly, slowly piecing together a portrait of a man almost nobody at the company had ever truly bothered to look at closely. Former colleagues told her he was always the first one in the building each morning, often arriving well before the sun had fully risen over the runway, and always the last to leave each night, long after everyone else had gone home to dinner with their families. He had a quiet habit of noticing small problems before they ever became visible on any screen or triggered any alert, and of repairing them without waiting for approval or expecting a single word of thanks in return. One older employee remembered a night years earlier when he had stayed awake for nearly 2 full days straight, refusing to leave the hangar until a plane scheduled to carry emergency medical supplies overseas was fully cleared to fly, and how no press release or company memo had ever once mentioned his name in connection with that flight or the lives it eventually saved. Victoria discovered that credit for his work had, time and again, been quietly absorbed by department heads eager to claim it as their own during performance reviews and executive briefings, and that he had never once objected or tried to correct the record in his own favor. She pulled old security footage out of a growing, uneasy curiosity. Watching grainy nighttime video of him walking alone through the hangar after every other technician had already gone home for the night, checking each aircraft one final time before locking the doors behind him. Nobody had ever asked him to perform those extra rounds, and nothing in his official job description required it of him. Yet the footage showed the same quiet routine repeated night after night for years without exception, a private ritual of vigilance that had never once been acknowledged by a single supervisor. Watching those tapes alone in the dim light of her office, Victoria felt something deeply uncomfortable settle into her chest, a growing certainty that she had built her entire understanding of value and worth around exactly the wrong measurements from the very beginning. One retired mechanic named Walter Combs, who had worked alongside Daniel for nearly a decade before retiring 3 years earlier, agreed to meet Victoria for coffee after she reached out through a mutual contact. Walter told her about a winter night when a charter carrying a group of transplant surgeons to a hospital 2 states away had developed a fuel irregularity just before departure, an issue the scheduled crew had already cleared as minor and safe to fly. Daniel, working a shift that was not even officially his own that night, insisted on running one additional check before signing off on the aircraft, delaying the flight by nearly 40 minutes, despite considerable pressure from an impatient dispatcher. The additional check revealed a failing fuel pump that would very likely have stranded the aircraft mid-flight, and the surgeons reached their destination safely aboard a replacement plane less than 2 hours later. Walter said Daniel never mentioned the incident again afterward, never filed a complaint about the pressure he had faced that night, and never once brought it up as evidence of his own value during the years that followed. Determined to make things right before the situation grew any worse, Victoria decided she needed to speak with him directly, though finding him proved far harder than she had expected it to be. He did not answer the calls she placed to his old contact number, and the emails she sent through the company system returned no reply of any kind, not even an automated one. A former coworker eventually mentioned, almost in passing during a hallway conversation, that he had taken a small position at a modest repair shop on the outskirts of town, fixing engines for crop dusters and other unglamorous agricultural aircraft that had nothing to do with the polished world of private charters he had left behind. Victoria drove out there herself one gray afternoon, leaving her assistant and her driver behind at the office, navigating roads that grew narrower and rougher the farther she traveled from the airport and its familiar comforts. The shop she eventually found was small and thoroughly unassuming, little more than a corrugated metal building with a single bay door propped open to let in the pale autumn light. Daniel was underneath an old engine when she arrived, his hands stained black with grease up to the wrist. Working with the same unhurried, deliberate focus she remembered from the hangar, as though nothing about his circumstances had changed at all. He looked up when her shadow crossed the doorway, showing no visible surprise at seeing her standing there, only a calm, steady attention that made her suddenly aware of just how carefully she needed to choose her next words. Victoria told him plainly, without any of her usual polish, that she wanted him to come back, that the company genuinely needed him, that 22 planes were sitting grounded because nobody else on staff understood them the way he clearly did. Daniel wiped his hands slowly on a rag hanging from his belt before answering her, allowing himself a small, tired smile that carried no bitterness in it at all. What mattered, he told her gently, was not really whether the company needed him, but whether the planes needed someone who actually understood them, someone willing to listen carefully rather than simply run through a checklist as fast as possible. Victoria pressed further, unwilling to leave without some kind of answer. and finally asked him the question that had been circling quietly in her mind since she first opened his notebooks in that dim storage alcove days earlier. She wanted to know why he had never once told anyone how important his work truly was, why he had let credit slip away from him year after year without so much as a single word of protest on his own behalf. Daniel considered the question for a long moment before he spoke, choosing his words with the same careful attention he once gave to deciding which wire to trust and which one to replace without hesitation. He told her that if a person ever had to announce how good they were at their job, it probably meant the work itself had not spoken loudly enough on its own to begin with. For 18 years, he said quietly, his only real concern had been whether the planes stayed safely in the sky and whether the people aboard them made it home to their families, and questions of personal recognition had simply never mattered to him the way they seemed to matter so much to everyone else around him. Victoria stood there in the doorway of that small shop, rain beginning to tap softly against the metal roof above them both, and felt something inside her go completely, unexpectedly still. She understood, in that quiet moment, that she had spent her entire tenure as chief executive evaluating people through reports and dashboards, mistaking visibility for value, and mistaking confidence for actual competence. The man standing in front of her had quietly protected an entire fleet of aircraft and the lives of everyone who ever flew on them, asking for nothing in return except the simple, modest dignity of being allowed to do his work well and without interference. Victoria had looked at that same devotion and called it slowness, had looked at that same humility and called it irrelevance, and the full weight of that mistake pressed down on her harder than any failed engine or missed deadline ever could have managed. She left the shop that afternoon without a firm answer from him, but with something far heavier riding quietly in the passenger seat of her car on the long drive back, a version of herself she no longer entirely recognized in the mirror. Back at the company, the board of directors had begun holding closed-door sessions without Victoria present, a development her assistant mentioned to her only reluctantly after being asked directly. 2 board members, both of whom had supported her appointment 18 months earlier, were now openly questioning whether her aggressive modernization strategy had been responsible for the crisis in the first place. Rumors circulated that an outside candidate was already being quietly considered as a replacement chief executive should the situation with the grounded fleet fail to resolve within the month. Victoria heard about these meetings the way most executives eventually hear about such things, and she understood clearly that her own position at the company she had worked so hard to lead was now genuinely at risk alongside everything else. The crisis at Falcon Arrow, meanwhile, had grown into something close to existential for the company as a whole, one of the company's largest and most valuable clients. A logistics firm that accounted for a significant share of Falcon Arrow's annual revenue sent formal notice threatening to terminate its contract entirely if the grounded fleet was not resolved within a matter of days. Losing that single client would very likely push Falcon Arrow toward bankruptcy, unraveling 3 decades of hard-won reputation and thousands of jobs in a matter of weeks rather than years. The final aircraft scheduled for that client's most urgent overseas shipment continued failing every inspection, despite the combined efforts of 3 separate engineering teams working around the clock, each one growing more frustrated than the last, each one certain the answer was somewhere just beyond their reach, yet unable to grasp it. Victoria felt the full weight of the company's uncertain future pressing down on her as she watched exhausted engineers argue bitterly over readouts that offered no real answers at all. She realized, somewhere in the middle of that sleepless week, that pride had no place left in the situation, and that pretending she still had control over something she clearly no longer understood would only make matters worse for everyone involved. She drove back out to the small repair shop one final time, without lawyers, without assistants, without a single rehearsed line prepared carefully in advance the way she usually approached difficult conversations. Standing in front of him again beneath the same corrugated roof, she said only 2 simple things: that she was truly sorry, and that she had been wrong about him from the very beginning of this entire ordeal. Daniel studied her face for a long, quiet moment, searching for something he seemed to eventually find there, before he finally asked her a simple, practical question, wanting to know exactly where the troubled aircraft was currently being kept. Victoria felt something loosen in her chest at those words. A fragile thread of hope she had not expected to feel again after so many days of failure and mounting dread. He gathered a small case of worn hand tools, said nothing more about apologies or past mistakes between them, and quietly followed her back toward the hangar, where 22 aircraft sat waiting beneath the gray autumn sky, like patients who had long since given up hope of ever receiving a proper diagnosis. When Daniel returned to the hangar that evening, he carried none of the laptops or diagnostic tablets that the younger engineers had come to rely on so heavily over the past few years. He walked the length of the troubled aircraft slowly and deliberately, running one hand along its cool metal skin, pausing every few steps to listen closely to something no instrument in the entire building had managed to register or measure. He climbed carefully inside, started the engine, and simply closed his eyes, listening with the kind of deep attention that came only from 18 patient years spent learning the particular language each individual machine used to quietly speak about its own pain. Within a few minutes, he had identified a faint, almost imperceptible vibration buried deep within the engine housing, a tremor so slight and so subtle that every sensor in the entire building had long since dismissed it as irrelevant background noise. Victoria stood off to the side during the entire process, close enough to watch but careful not to interrupt the quiet concentration filling the hangar around her. She noticed that Daniel worked without any of the urgency the rest of the building had carried for weeks, moving instead with the unhurried patience of a man who understood that rushing a machine rarely made it tell the truth any faster. At one point he stopped entirely, closed his eyes again, and simply rested his palm flat against the engine housing for nearly a full minute without speaking, as though waiting for the aircraft itself to finish a sentence it had been trying to say for days. Nobody in the hangar dared to break that silence, not even the exhausted engineers who had spent 3 sleepless nights chasing an answer that had been sitting quietly under their hands the entire time. The younger engineers gathered around him in the hangar, half skeptical and half hopeful, watching closely as he traced the vibration back to a single worn component, a rare and unusual kind of wear that none of their standard checklists had ever been designed to catch or anticipate. It was the sort of flaw that revealed itself only to someone who had spent years learning not just how planes were built, but how they aged over time, how their smallest parts spoke quietly long before they ever failed completely and without warning. Within a matter of hours, working alongside a small team he patiently guided, rather than simply commanded from above, Daniel had the aircraft running clean and steady, passing every remaining inspection without a single flagged warning appearing on any screen. Word spread quickly through the hangar and beyond it, and one by one, the remaining 21 grounded planes were brought to him for inspection, each one diagnosed and carefully repaired under his quiet, methodical direction, until the entire fleet stood ready to fly once more into the open sky. Marcus Webb was among the small crew who worked alongside Daniel that night, and he found himself watching the older man's hands with a kind of attention he had never given to anyone at Falcon Arrow before. At one point, Daniel paused, handed him a simple tool, and asked him quietly to feel a particular section of housing himself, before explaining what he was listening for and why it mattered more than any reading on a screen. Marcus felt the faint tremor beneath his own fingers for the first time, and said nothing for a long moment, humbled in a way his certifications had never quite prepared him for. Before the night ended, he found Daniel near the tool cabinet, and, without any of his old confidence, apologized quietly for years of careless jokes made at his expense. Daniel only nodded once, told him it was already forgotten, and handed him another tool, ready to keep working as though nothing between them needed to be discussed any further than that. In the days that followed, Victoria called every employee together for a company-wide meeting, standing before hundreds of staff members gathered in the largest hangar on the entire property. She told them plainly, without softening the truth or protecting her own carefully built image, that the person who had ultimately saved Falcon Arrow from complete collapse was the very same man she herself had dismissed only weeks earlier without a second thought. A heavy, respectful silence fell across the room as her words settled over the crowd, broken only by the distant hum of machinery somewhere outside the open hangar doors. Victoria turned directly to Daniel, standing quietly near the back of the crowd exactly where he always seemed to prefer being, and offered him a public apology that held nothing back at all, acknowledging in front of everyone present how completely and thoroughly she had misjudged him. Later that same week, Victoria sat alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home, reviewing the original spreadsheet she had once used to justify letting Daniel go in the first place. She scrolled slowly through columns of numbers that had once seemed so clear and so decisive. Efficiency scores, and processing times, and software proficiency ratings, none of which had ever once measured whether a man could hear a problem before it became one. She deleted the file that night without printing it or filing it away, understanding finally that the tool itself had never been the real problem, only the blind trust she had placed in it above everything else. It was a small, private gesture that nobody else in the company would ever know about, but it marked the quiet beginning of a very different kind of leadership than the one she had arrived with 18 months earlier. She announced sweeping changes to the company that same afternoon, dismantling the rigid, numbers-only evaluation system that had once decided so carelessly who stayed and who was quietly let go without proper consideration. In its place, she introduced what she called the Knowledge Legacy Program, a formal, funded effort to document and preserve the accumulated wisdom of the company's most experienced technicians before that irreplaceable knowledge could ever again walk quietly out the door, unnoticed and unrecorded. She offered Daniel the title of Director of Technical Excellence, a position that came with a large private office and considerable authority over company-wide training programs. Daniel declined the title gently but firmly, telling her he had no real interest in an office removed from the hangar floor he had always called home, and asked instead only to be brought back as a senior aircraft engineer, close to the machines he had always understood best and never wished to leave behind for long. In the months that followed this quiet turning point, Falcon Aero transformed into the safest maintenance operation in the entire region, its reputation rebuilt on a foundation far sturdier than the one Victoria had originally tried so hard to construct through speed and automation alone. Victoria herself changed considerably as well, spending far less time behind her glass office walls and far more time down in the hangar, sitting quietly among the technicians as they worked, learning slowly to listen the way Daniel had always listened without needing to be taught. She began asking genuine questions instead of issuing rigid directives from above. And she started noticing the same quiet dedication in other employees she had once carelessly overlooked entirely, people whose true value had never once shown up clearly on any spreadsheet she had built. Daniel, in turn, became something like a mentor to the younger staff around him, patiently teaching them to run their hands along cold metal instead of trusting screens alone for every answer. And slowly, gradually, the old nickname that once followed him quietly through the hallways disappeared completely, replaced instead by something closer to genuine, lasting respect. The Knowledge Legacy Program grew faster than Victoria had originally anticipated, eventually pairing every technician with fewer than 5 years of experience, alongside a senior mentor, willing to teach the kind of instincts no manual could properly capture. Daniel found himself training a rotating group of 6 younger staff members every quarter, walking them slowly through the hangar, and teaching them to notice the small, quiet signs a machine gives before it ever fails completely. He kept a new notebook for each group, writing down their questions and mistakes with the same careful hand he had once used only for himself, and for the first time in 18 years, his knowledge belonged to more than just the inside of his own head. Victoria sat in on several of those sessions herself, taking notes like any other trainee, and slowly came to understand that leadership had less to do with issuing decisions from a glass office and far more to do with knowing which voices in a room deserved to be trusted. On the evening Falcon Aero received a National Industry Award for outstanding safety performance, Victoria stood at a podium in front of employees, competitors, and journalists from several publications and chose her words that night with unusual, deliberate care. She told the gathered audience that airplanes were kept safely in the sky not by the people who spoke the loudest in boardrooms or the ones who appeared most confident in quarterly presentations, but by the ones who worked quietly, hour after hour, tightening a single bolt correctly simply because a single human life depended entirely on it. The room rose to its feet in genuine applause, a warm wave of sound rolling through the very hangar that had once stood empty and silent under the crushing weight of 22 grounded planes only months earlier. Daniel stood near the back once again, exactly where he always preferred to be, and allowed himself a small, genuine smile, the first true public acknowledgement in nearly 2 decades that the quiet, patient work of his hands had finally been seen and understood for what it truly was worth all along. Walter Combs came out of retirement briefly to attend the award ceremony, standing near the back beside several other former employees who had returned just to see Daniel recognized properly at last. He told a reporter afterward, almost in passing, that men like Daniel had always existed quietly inside companies like Falcon Arrow, holding the entire operation together through sheer patience and care, while receiving little acknowledgement for it. What made this particular story different, he said, was not that such a man existed, but that someone in power had finally taken the time to notice him before it was too late to matter. The reporter printed the quote almost exactly as spoken. And for weeks afterward, other companies in the industry began quietly reviewing their own maintenance staff with a little more care than before. Victoria and Daniel did not rush toward anything resembling romance in the months that followed this remarkable turnaround, content instead to let something steadier take root gradually between them, a mutual respect built slowly and carefully out of honesty, shared purpose, and hard-won humility. They developed an easy, comfortable understanding, an unspoken agreement that neither one of them ever needed to fully explain aloud, built patiently from long conversations in the hangar about engines, past mistakes, and the particular kind of people who were truly worth trusting in this world. What grew between them was not urgency but genuine patience. The very same patience Daniel had always brought so naturally to his work, now extended quietly and carefully into the way the two of them treated each other in the months that followed. Together, they made a quiet, private promise to reshape Falcon Arrow permanently into a place where real skill and genuine dedication would always matter more than appearances, more than fancy titles, and more than how loudly someone chose to speak about their own worth to a room full of people. The rain that had followed Daniel out of the building on the day he was carelessly fired eventually gave way to clearer autumn skies over the airfield. Though neither he nor Victoria ever fully forgot the hard lesson those gray, uncertain weeks had taught them both. 22 planes had once sat grounded because a company had forgotten how to recognize its own quiet strength, mistaking silence for weakness and steadiness for stagnation in a way that had nearly cost everything they had built together. In the end, it was not the sharpest new software or the newest available technology that had truly saved Falcon Arrow from ruin, but the patient hands and unspoken devotion of a man who had never once asked to be noticed or thanked for his service. And somewhere in that hangar, long after the applause had finally faded and the shining award had been placed carefully on a shelf for visitors to admire, a single engine hummed steadily and confidently to life once more, carrying with it the quiet, enduring proof that some of the most important work in this world is done, day after day, by people who never once demand to be seen.